This is Bitcoin Magazine Happy Hour, everybody. I'm your host, Colin Harper, and today with me I've got Dave Hollerith, Brandon Green, and Michael Taiberg.
Hello.
Howdy, guys.
All right, so this week we're going to be going over the IRS's new crypto guidelines, which came out this week. It was the first concrete guidance they've given in 5 years. Dealt a lot with airdrops and hard forks. Clarified a few other things. Left some questions still unanswered. We're also going to be going over Lee Kuen's bombshell article from DevCon 5. And so talking about how Ethereum said, how Joseph Lubin of Vitalik basically admitted on stage that Ethereum can't scale, and the community's still optimistic about ETH 2.0, so we'll be diving into that a little bit. We're also going to talk about the Hong Kong protests and a little bit about the quote-unquote free speech network Gab doubling down on Bitcoin. So let's go ahead and just get started. So the United States Internal Revenue Service recently released some Q&As and some guidelines and clarifications about its cryptocurrency tax policy. A few key things to go over before we dive into some analysis. Wallet-to-wallet transfers, to yourself are not taxable events. That makes sense. A big win for us. For people who want to spend Bitcoin like myself, sorry, kind of sucks. That is not exempt from capital gains tax. If you spend Bitcoin on a good or service, you have to report that on your tax returns as either a capital gain or capital loss, depending on the price of the asset when you bought it and when you sold it.
Well,
which makes total sense, though, right?
But they did add in there that you can choose, if you have all the transaction information, you can choose, quote unquote, which coins you use.
So this is pretty cool because they don't take your wallet total, all the coins that you have in there as one sum. You can take, like Brandon said, certain transactions and say, I bought 0.5 Bitcoin on November whatever 2017, and I sold it on November whatever 2019, and you can actually pinpoint those transactions themselves. Which is pretty cool. It's kind of nice that they recognize the difference between, certain holdings and times when you bought in and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, it adds, it lets you have, some sort of optimal way of spending your Bitcoins. If you're going to spend a lot and you didn't just buy some, you're going to have a capital gains tax regardless, you can aim for those, 1 year or longer held coins, get that lower capital gains rate. Whereas if you just want to buy and spend somewhere, you can buy and spend without having to impact the rest of your holdings. So.
Right. That's a really good point because you could basically say, okay, well, I bought these coins at this, let's say I bought these coins 3 months ago and I spent them today, instead of saying I bought these coins 2 years ago and spent them today, because then the capital gains for the latter transaction is obviously a lot more and you would have to pay more on the transaction.
Exactly.
So there's a little bit of leeway there. But I think the big takeaway from this, or what people have been really talking about, is what the IRS is doing to treat forks and airdrops, and how they're using those two mechanisms to define what your total cryptocurrency income is for capital gains. And Brandon, I know you've got some thoughts on this, so I'll let you kind of take it over from here.
Yeah, I can riff on this for a second. And, if I could have one word that would just be to describe this whole guideline, would be just whack. I mean, they're just not thinking about what their guideline means. The short of it is that any sort of fork or airdropped coin counts as income the moment that you got the coins. The moment the fork happened, really, is what they're saying. So it leaves a ton of questions. First and foremost, there's a huge attack vector where basically anyone can go out, make their forked coin, because it's all open source, even make their own exchange that they're trading it on, trade $1 worth of volume, put it at a ridiculously high, quadrillion-dollar market cap, and force everyone who owns the coin, and, that could be anyone. You could even send your private keys to someone, and then, quote-unquote, they have the coin, and basically give them, $1 trillion worth of income that they'll never be able to actually realize.
I feel like that situation is not very likely, though. Because you have to have a market rate. We talked about this yesterday, right? If there's no set value or no going market rate for the coin, then you can't just set an arbitrary market cap and say this coin is worth this, because if the market isn't buying that asset for that, yeah, but the IRS isn't going to look at that and be like, yes, Mr. Green has $1 trillion worth of income for 2019. there's no way they're going to take that seriously because it's not a real asset.
Well, really, they just haven't defined what a market rate is, right? Like
that is true, and that's
one exchange.
Yeah, that is true, and that's another problem I think that this kind of unearths, and we talked about it a little bit yesterday, is like I think you set out 3 scenarios, right? So it's like you can either define it, like let's say you got forked coins from Coinbase, right? You can either define the market rate as immediately when it hits your wallet, the forked coin, which is very hard to do because like who knows what the market rate is. The first time, a market rate really shows up on exchanges, like the first time it's actively traded and goes into the order books, or you could define the market rate for that forked coin at the time that you actually come in possession of it, right? Because like Coinbase did not give every Bitcoin holder or user on their platform their Bitcoin Cash the second it was forked. It was something like like a year later or something like that?
It wasn't a year later, but
a few months.
It was a few months. I mean, the Coinbase thing specifically is going to be a really interesting case study because basically Bitcoin Cash was forked in July. Coinbase added it in December.
2017, by the way.
2017. Maybe it was August, but late July, August, something like that. And they didn't like the day that they added it to Coinbase, they didn't allow sell orders for a few hours. And so what ended up happening is the price got bought up and bought up and bought up because there was no ability to actually sell on there. And basically the price went from like $2,500. This is specifically on Coinbase's exchange. $2,500 all the way up to almost $9,000 per Bitcoin Cash. So the question is like, when did that income count for the Coinbase holders of Bitcoin? Was it when Bitcoin Cash was forked, when they literally didn't have the coin yet? Was it when Coinbase awarded it to their account when it was like $2,500? Or was it when they allowed selling orders, which was when it hit like $8,500? And if you say, all 3 of those could be what the IRS rules. It's like I have no idea what they're going to say. They're clearly not paying attention. But the problem is that they could make the argument that it's when you're able to sell your Bitcoin Cash, which would be at $9,000 per Bitcoin Cash. And so like people holding a few Bitcoins on Coinbase are going to have to go back to their 2017 filings, amend them with this extra income of a few Bitcoin Cash tokens, and figure out how to pay income tax on that when one Bitcoin Cash now is like $200.
Yeah, for sure. And like one of the things that I think is interesting about some of the things that you're saying there about the timing of claiming the asset, right? It's like, how do we even define when the asset is claimed or even how it's claimed, right? Like for instance, if you're talking to some Bitcoiners, now this like distinction might not work for regulators, but if you're holding your Bitcoin on an exchange, you don't even hold the keys to that. Technically, you don't own that asset, at least for us, right? Now, in the eyes of the IRS and your regulators, like by all rights, you have the password to your account. So yes, you do own those assets. But Coinbase is the one holding those coins, right? The forked coins. We did not even have a chance to, those who used Coinbase, to have those funds until later, right? And this gets even trickier when you look at like other exchanges like Binance. We're like, I'm sure anyone who's had a Binance account since it opened in 2017, like you've gotten loads of airdrops, like the Tron airdrop in November 2017 for like 500 TRX. Like they supported Super Bitcoin when that forked. So if you had any Bitcoin on and like Bitcoin Diamond, they've supported a bunch of Bitcoin forks. And like, for me, the big question is like a lot of these airdrops and these forks aren't, to put it bluntly, like consensual. So it's like I'm not touching those assets. I'm not even trying to liquidate them sometimes. Like I'm just leaving them because they're not even worth touching. Like they're shit coins and I don't consider those part of anything that I would want to hold, right? I think Stop and Decrypt on Twitter said it like if someone drops a bag of trash off on your doorstep, are you liable for that trash? And that's simplifying it a little bit. But I think that raises an interesting question for what constitutes actual control of an asset and what constitutes claiming an asset. And something that I talked about yesterday when we recorded the podcast for the first time when we had audio issues was this idea of like how many of you, if you use Ethereum, have opened up your Ethereum wallet and just found a bunch of random tokens that you had no idea where they came from and they were just random airdrops, right? Well, I have an Ethereum wallet with probably about 12 shitcoins on it that were airdropped to me through different times throughout my holding period of whatever tokens I had that constituted those airdrops. And, I would not consider them being in my wallet as me claiming those, right? Because I have no intention to do anything with those tokens. For me, it would make sense that claiming a token would be when you move to liquidate or move to custody it, right, outside of the wallet that it was airdropped in, whether that be an exchange or something else.
That makes sense. It just seems like at this point nobody has any clue like what a custody would be and not be, because there's not like a lot of like officialized kind of things like that. Like, who's to say one exchange would be a custody and another one wouldn't be? But it sounds like in general these regulations are just super complicated. Like, I read like the examples they use for like these kind of scenarios. They're hypothetical, and they also just kind of show that the IRS doesn't really understand how the technology works at all.
Yeah, well, and unfortunately, custody part doesn't matter, because they already said it's not about the custody of it. It's about where, like, what was it worth when it was forked. So it's not even, you don't even have to take really, any external steps to claim these tokens. If they're attached to your private keys for one token, like, for Ethereum or for Bitcoin or whatever, you are liable for that income, period, in a discussion. That's what they just said.
Yeah, I know. And I guess my point is, I think that's just like misguided, because it like.
Absolutely. I'll give you, one quick other scenario, a doomsday scenario of this. But, we had a real issue with some of these Bitcoin forks about replay protection, right? Basically, the ability to actually claim these new tokens, and when you transfer them, not have the worry of a Bitcoin miner or another miner potentially, also taking your Bitcoin in that same transaction. That's why replay protection is so important. If you all of a sudden, when a new fork happens, you have to move that to an exchange ASAP in order to realize that income so that you don't lose money in taxes on it. Now you're also putting your Bitcoin up in an incredibly precarious situation where you could just flat out lose it because of poor replay protection or poor, development on this new fork. So it's just, it's ludicrous to think of people actually having to comply with this. I think the one maybe saving grace is what Neeraj and Peter Van Valkenburg at Coin Center were talking about, which was that you could still make the argument, and you're making an argument, right, at this point, so this is going to be settled by some arbiter somewhere, but you can make the argument that really at the moment of the fork, the market around these coins are zero. Even if the market springs up just seconds afterwards, at the moment of the fork, the real value of these forked tokens is zero, and therefore you can claim all the income as zero and then only pay it when you sell the property or the token and claim that capital gains tax liability. And that's what makes the most sense, right? That protects everyone from these random forks. It's how other things that are treated as property work. You don't realize when a cow has a baby, you don't realize that as income right there on the spot. You realize it when you sell the new cow, right? Like, this is the same kind of deal. So, hopefully there's going to be some future clearing up of this. Maybe even the IRS comes out and says, we actually got this guideline wrong. A guy can dream, right? But for now, I think it's pretty ludicrous. My word is whack. And, that's all I have to say about that.
All right, well, we'll just whack on to the next topic then, I guess.
Whoa.
Let's whack off? Is that better? Whack around. How about that?
Neither of those. The word whack.
No comment.
All right, so let's go ahead and dive into Lee Kuen's article for CoinDesk titled Scam or Iteration at DevCon. Scam is in quotes, by the way. Scam or Iteration at DevCon. Ethereum diehards still believe in 2.0. Quick caveat, Lee probably did not write that headline, so if you guys are like castigating her for that on Twitter, just make sure that you're actually throwing criticism around for the body of the text itself. And the reason I say that is because I think calling Ethereum a scam is a little heavy-handed. I don't know which editor put that in there, but at the end of the day, the substance behind this article is pretty sound, right? Basically what Lee is criticizing here is Joseph Lubin and Vitalik Buterin at a recent conference. Don't remember which conference it was.
Ethereal Tel Aviv.
Yep, Ethereal Tel Aviv. Basically said, and I quote, Joseph Lubin said, "We knew it wasn't going to be able to scale for sure." Vitalik nodded his head in affirmation. And this really blew up within the Bitcoin community. And a lot of people, like Grubels from Blockstream was all over this. People saying basically like, y'all, we fucking told you so. Like, this thing has been a scam from day one. It was marketed as being scalable. If you look at the marketing literature, it actually was marketed as a scalable platform. And in Lee's piece, she dives into a lot of primary source interviews with, Vitalik and people building on dApps on Ethereum. And she highlights this contrast between Ethereum's future uncertainty and the Ethereum community's effusive support and optimism for the platform, even as this monolithic or this behemoth undertaking of migrating all of Ethereum onto this new platform that we still don't even know how it's going to work is being discussed. She says ETH 2.0 is about 2 years away. There's no plan for figuring out how we're going to migrate all of these dApps, all the money Legos.
Just 2 years away, trademark.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, think about how many times we've heard about Constantinople hard fork and proof of stake. I mean, all this stuff has been talked about for a long time. And I don't know. What do you guys think? Are we blowing the lid off of a scam in this case, or is this just a lot of growing pains that Ethereum is having to go through, right? Because people obviously on the Ethereum side of the field, basically said, how dare you write this kind of hit piece? You're devaluing all these years of hard work from all these developers in this decentralized community. And then Bitcoiners and other people and some no-coiners are saying this is hard-hitting journalism, exposing some flaws in a system that has made promises that it really can't keep right now.
Yeah, I mean, my hot take on it, though, is that, she was apparently presenting or on stage, at least, at DevCon 5 and got really berated by some of the people at the conference. There was some real vitriol spewed her way. I think that in and of itself is a shame. We should, hold ourselves to a standard where we're not berating journalists. I'm speaking as a media, part of a media company here, but, she's doing her job, and maybe the headline was harsh, but we've got to be good enough and cool enough to be able to take a harsh headline without turning around and making a journalist feel like they're not welcome or feel unsafe or feel like they can't talk to you.
She likened it to a Trump rally on one of her tweets. She's which I think I'm gonna go ahead and be honest.
Response to her.
No, she said the response is akin to something that you'd see at a Trump rally, which I don't know, I think that's a little embellished.
Yeah, I mean, Ethereum, Bitcoin, they are religions to people who have gotten into this, and then they're also we're all financially involved in it, so the incentives there. Everybody has a different reason for how they want to take this article, and I think it's it makes perfect sense that you would get really pissed off with her if she's just this journalist coming in and trying to create scandal. But all that to say, it seems like everything she's put out there is pretty damn relevant, and that needs to be called out.
Yeah, she's asking the right questions, and she's getting at the heart of what a lot of Bitcoiners are saying. That being said, coming from a Bitcoiner myself, you have to understand this article is very much written from the perspective of a Bitcoiner. You can tell in her tone, and Lee is a Bitcoiner, right? She's always been very hard on ICOs and token projects in her reporting. That's kind of been one of her sticks, is talking to these token companies and kind of unearthing the scamminess underneath. But, it is very much written from the perspective of a Bitcoiner. I think that's why so many Ethereans and ETH heads really did not like it, because it is biased, right? But by the same token, you could say it's biased for a reason. There's a reason that Bitcoin has, for me at least, Bitcoin has proven its use case as a decentralized monetary system. And that's it. That's all you need to say. People always trying to give these narratives to Bitcoin. Obviously there's digital gold in there. There's the promise of a decentralized payment system. But at its core, Bitcoin, what Satoshi created, was a decentralized monetary system. We have that use case. It exists. There's a need for it. We've seen it stress tested and used. But to her credit, and to the credit of all Bitcoiners have been saying this, Ethereum's promise to be a decentralized financial system in a decentralized web with all of these apps that are going to decentralize everything we do, it's so far it's a pie in the sky dream.
It's a boil the ocean tactic.
I don't know. I think one of the more interesting things coming out of this, and you kind of hit on it, Dave, was we are starting to see like the way that Ethereans reacted to this news the same way that Bitcoiners react to like mainstream news FUD. Yeah. Right? Like going back to the boiling the oceans and like, it's used by drug dealers. And they're really starting to consolidate their own kind of their own religion, and they have their own dogma. And like that's the response that you saw to Lee was like this like kind of like hard line. Yeah, like kind of exactly. It's like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. And like,
she made big claims.
Yeah, I mean, she made
basically.
Yeah, and also, the way that she wrote the article, she uses this juxtaposition, right, which is a really strong rhetorical tool to get, and kind of an emotional response, because basically you're pointing out incongruities. You're saying, on the one hand, this thing, it turns out like doesn't work really in the way that it is right now, and yet here I am at the big conference of people trying to make it work. And they're all over the moon about it, right? Like trying to make this pie-in-the-sky dream of a ETH 2.0 come true. And so like that right there, the way that she formed the article was always going to bring a gut reaction from people who, love ETH. So I'll concede that. I still think, though, we got to hold ourselves to a higher standard than, berating someone at a conference.
Oh, no, yeah. I totally – I mean, I agree with that. Like you shouldn't just like – I don't know like what was said because like I don't – like I haven't seen audio or video. It could have just been like a single heckler basically just saying "fuck you," which like still like not a good show, but like.
But even on Twitter afterwards, when she was kind of pointing it out, there were plenty of people who were jumping in saying, "Well, you got what you deserve," and blah blah blah.
Yeah, that's true. But like to be fair, how many times have Bitcoiners in their toxic maximalist style just gone on Twitter and absolutely fucking roasted somebody?
Well, it's true, right? I mean, This is one of the things that I still to this day have to reconcile, and it's what you guys already hit on, is the fact that, in this space, we have a blurred line between, a movement based on ideological principles versus some sort of weird cult-like feeling where anyone who criticizes is attacking us, even with legitimate criticisms. And there are always going to be legitimate criticisms. There are a lot of illegitimate criticisms that come out, right? But there are legitimate criticisms. We have to treat those with logic and with measured response and with reasoned debate. And yet, anytime someone comes in with a point made against XYZ, there's a mafia, Twitter mob coming up and springing up around them. And that delegitimizes us. That makes us look like we're just a bunch of emotionally charged people trying to pump our backs.
Well, yeah, imagine being an outsider to the crypto industry and you make a criticism and then suddenly some like anonymous cartoon is calling you like a fiat boy or like something like that on Twitter.
Or worse.
Or worse. Or like, like a fucking fiat pig. Like, so like, yeah, to your point, like, I think that's the important thing here. And, like, I think that this criticism is legitimate. Like, I think that, like – now, what I will say is, like, calling it a scam – and, again, I'm not saying she did this. That was put in the headline by an editor more than likely. Like, calling this a scam is too far for me because, like, saying it's a scam implies that there is nothing going on, that there is no development, people aren't trying, and that Vitalik, Lubin, Diorio, all those dudes just took the money and ran, right? I mean, like – some people are less involved in the project now than they used to be, like Charles Hoskinson. Like he cashed out and started his own new shit coin, right? But I'm also of the mindset of, like, let's wait and see what Ethereum 2.0 does. Like, I'm not optimistic about it, but they are trying to build a movement here. But I do think the big takeaway from this is, like, a lot of really smart Bitcoiners have been saying for years, it's like what Ethereum wants to do. It's not there yet, and we can't make these promises. And I think that really is the straw that broke the camel's back is the promises.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, and but the flip side of it is that ultimately what we all strive for in this space is anti-fragility. And if you're going to have anti-fragility, that means that you got to be able to take the criticisms and let them just bounce right off. And so Bitcoin has taken criticism after criticism after criticism. And you don't have to, worry about, is Bitcoin going to survive this whole it's heating up the oceans because it's causing climate change kind of criticism? Of course it's going to survive. It's anti-fragile. And the more people use this against Bitcoin, the more it's just not going to affect Bitcoin. When people are seeing, this first really valid criticism about Ethereum that, they marketed this as like a scalable solution and it wasn't scalable and they knew it, right? Like, you've got to be able to take that criticism, reckon with it, look Ethereum in the mirror and basically say, this was a mistake by everyone involved to try and say that this is, a scalable thing when it wasn't, and they knew it wasn't. All right, that's fact. But now let's move past that. If you're an Ethereum person and you say, we're still building something important, and ultimately this criticism doesn't matter because ETH 2.0 is going to come and it's going to be great, and proof of stake and all that, whatever people care about in Ethereum. But when you fall on the sword of someone calling your token a scam, understand the third party objective viewpoint, watching that happen, and saying ooh, she really hit on something here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the big distinction is obviously I think this because I'm a Bitcoiner, but going back to the idea, I think Bitcoin has proven that it has a use case. In the early days, it was uncertain, right? And there was a lot of FUD and there was a lot of legitimate criticisms lobbed towards its community. But we withstood those. We've continued to evolve a narrative that has stuck and makes sense to people. Ethereum is really still searching for a narrative. And to say that it is a sure thing is just not true. And I think that's what this criticism, what this piece is really peeling back the layers and saying, look, guys, it could be real, but don't act like you're there yet. Because so many Ethereans act like they're there on Twitter, and they're just not yet. But anyway, we're going to move on. Hong Kong protests next. We want to do that, and the more specifically, not the Astros? Was it Houston
Rockets?
The Rockets, yeah. The Houston Rockets, the news that their general manager tweeted in favor of the Hong Kong protesters, and China basically said we're not going to air your games anymore over in mainland China. And we're starting to see it's kind of become a thing where certain I think Blizzard did something too about revoking some dude's winnings from some esports tournament. You're starting to see this whole the whole Hong Kong protest become an exercise in what political speech is, and also what corporate speech is, and how easily that can be censored.
And also national power.
Yeah, absolutely.
China is seems to be pulling the strings behind all of this and doing a pretty good job of silencing people.
Yeah, I mean, we should go through the TLDR of what exactly the protest is and all that kind of stuff. The one thing I'll add to all of this is, believe it or not, South Park has just hit the nail on the head in terms of showing the ridiculous. South Park's probably the best satirical publication we still have in the U.S. They hit the nose on the head every single time. It is so good, and you should see their Banned in China episode. It's hilarious.
When did this come out?
It came out last week.
And Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, issued this letter after the NBA stuff. And they said, like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese censors into our homes and into our hearts. We too love money more than freedom and democracy. Z doesn't just look like Winnie the Pooh at all. Tune into our 300th episode this Wednesday at 10. Long live the great Communist Party of China. May this autumn sorghum harvest be bountiful. We good now, China? Just totally spitting in the face of this. They hit the nail on the head, like Brandon was saying. This is all about corporate censorship and sucking up to the powers that be. So, taking a step back, these Hong Kong protests have been going on for about, since the Wikipedia says March. It's basically been all of 2019. And they started in response to an extradition bill that was going to be signed by Hong Kong's leadership. It basically would have made it possible to extradite any political prisoners or really anyone from Hong Kong to mainland China without really any probable cause or just cause at all.
Anybody who got any sort of you could get some sort of traffic violation or something.
Very.
In a Chinese court.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and more importantly, you could break a law that's a law in mainland China, but isn't a law in Hong Kong,
and be tried
and China
for it,
can still extradite you back to mainland China for that, law you're breaking, and try you in mainland China, even though you're living in Hong Kong. You were in Hong Kong when it happened. The obvious one being criticizing Xi Jinping, right?
Yeah.
If you do that while you're in Hong Kong and this extradition bill passes, now you are extradited back to mainland, and you probably like disappear.
Yeah, and that's really important context. I mean, this would be like, I don't know, imagine if like DC somehow were an independent state.
It's weird.
And like you lived in DC and you said something about Trump, and then Trump like extradited you to like mainland America. But anyway, it sparked like effusive protests from the Hong Kong populace. I mean, they've been marching to the tune of like 2 million people. Like there have been multiple marches with more than 2 million people. And I think this is something like I was listening to like NPR, and I think they said something like how much, let's see what Hong Kong's populace is really quickly. Yeah, the Hong Kong's total population is 7 million. So 2 million people. I mean, you're talking about more than a fourth of their populace are marching in protest of this thing. And violence has escalated. There have been a lot of protesters who have, started basically fighting with police openly in the streets with things like petrol bombs and things like that. Police have actually started using their firearms to suppress certain protests. I mean, that's why I think people were getting so obviously fired up about the NBA buckling, right? Or like, because what ended up happening with that? Like, did the NBA issue an apology? Like, what?
No, so actually Adam Silver went on a press conference yesterday and spoke out in support of Hong Kong. So it actually made it a little more complicated now because the NBA is not really just folding to what China wants them to say.
That's good.
Well, I mean, China's already pulled all their merchandise off the shelves, and they're already not filming this NBA exhibition game that was over there. So, like, what does the NBA have to lose at this point, I guess? But,
I know NBA, I know they probably have, a lot.
A $4.5 billion business is what they would have to lose. But it's crazy because they're not the only company that's like that. There's many American companies.
Yeah, but to your point, Taiberg, I mean, the NBA is super popular in China. They get a lot of fucking money from the Chinese market. So, I mean, certainly they're not going to.
It's a sensitive subject. Like, they have a lot to lose.
Yeah, they do have a lot to lose. But, to Brandon's point, I don't know if they're going to go. I mean, I don't know how big their market share is in China. I don't know, what percentage.
The NBA's?
Yeah, I don't know, what percentage of their gross revenue or net revenue is from the Chinese market. I'd imagine it's probably pretty sizable, but we've also got a lot of shit ton of NBA fans in America.
Yeah, but China is a really big NBA country.
Yeah, for sure.
They're huge.
Didn't Nike do something recently about I saw something
they pulled the Rockets merchandise out of their stores.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
In China.
There's been,
but to play devil's advocate for a second, and this is actually kind of a depressing, we're all helpless kind of devil's advocate, but all these American companies criticizing China for the whole Hong Kong riots and stuff. They're not Hong Kong riots; they're Hong Kong protests. Important distinction, right? Ultimately, are all for naught because China controls their media anyways. No one in China is actually seeing these criticisms. That's the whole point. China has the Great Firewall. They control what their people see. There's no reason to be criticizing all of this because ultimately the people in China, you're not going to sway their opinions. They have no idea what you said. China is controlling them, and of course it doesn't make sense to actively, side with Hong Kong or side against mainland China on this issue because ultimately you're talking to Americans about it, and no one in China is going to see it, and you may lose billions of dollars of business by doing it. So it's a weird, almost like you're virtue signaling to all of us where you're not actually creating any change because China already has a system to prevent that change from happening.
Yeah, I mean, it totally is. I mean, well, it's just it's ethically blind though is the thing, and but obviously capital doesn't care about ethics. Capitalism often doesn't. But you are, like you said. I think I saw something on Twitter today where it was some dude posted the Colin Kaepernick believe stand up for something you believe in if you've been sacrificing everything, and they're yes, Nike's sacrificing so much by bowing to the Chinese leadership, right? And I always thought when that ad came out, I thought it was hilarious because Nike sales skyrocketed and all this stuff, and I think that for me personally, political consumerism like, or just even any sort of like boycott culture, like you saw with like Chick-fil-A back in like whatever that was, 2013, 2014, or like the obverse where people were buying into a product because of a political stance. It's like exactly. It's like, do you not realize this is just a political move? Like they're just playing to your sensibilities because they want your money. And like obviously Nike showed just how toothless it was when it pulled the stuff off the shelves because it cares about its bottom line. And like Brandon was saying, the Chinese are not going to see or hear anything that we hear or see about all of this stuff, so it doesn't matter to them. Makes no difference to them. For us, all we care about is like, oh, are the brands that we hold near and dear to our heart, like, you know, fighting the good fight, fighting for democracy. And like, obviously, of course, they're not.
I think that's super interesting. Just because, like, can you imagine for a second, like, what it would be like if like corporate entities were trying to like, cater to like a bunch of Bitcoiners, like how freaking weird that would end up being. Like,
Dude,
they would
just wait for the Bitcoin lifestyle brands to come out. Like, I'll give it a few years. Just wait.
Like, they're just like, you know, like, you don't need anything. You don't need us. So buy these shoes.
Radical self-reliance. It's like full node in your fucking shoes, man.
But something to be said. A lot of this really it was brought on by Twitter, right? Like when these corporate entities got a Twitter account, and all of a sudden could just kind of like throw out there whatever they were thinking. You had some really weird tweets coming out, like when it first started. There's a lot of companies like talking about mass shootings or talking about 9/11 or like that kind of stuff. Whereas like, you know, thanks Pillsbury Toaster Strudel for talking about, there's a weird figuring out. I'm not saying Pillsbury talked about that, but corporate entities are having to figure out like how to play political and like, you know, big things that are happening. And like, should they voice their opinion on? Like, what is their role in all of this stuff? And I don't know.
Well, it's funny. It's because it's playing into a wider trend of corporate personification. Like, how many times have you been on your Twitter feed and you've seen like Wendy's do like a snarky, like ironic, tweet? You know, it's like, and they
knocking Burger King. Or
yeah,
something.
exactly. Like talking about who has the best chicken sandwich. Like, do you remember that fight between like Chick-fil-A, Popeyes, and like Wendy's? And it's like, are you kidding me, guys?
And that whole scenario is considered like it's like a
viral marketing
case study.
Yeah, it is viral marketing. And like, I saw one recently, man, where they took a Twitter influencer chick. Like, she does makeup videos. I mean, I don't know what these chicks do, but like, and like, she was tweeting from her Twitter account, and it was promoted by Wendy's. She's like, "Spicy nugs, they're back at Wendy's." Like, oh my god, I love it. It's like, no, you don't. Like, no, you don't love spicy nuggets. Like, you might like them occasionally when you're drunk as fuck.
She actually likes spicy.
Oh, she might like spicy nuggets, but like, who? Like, no one's eating those spicy nugs, man. But like, back to Brandon's point, like, where are corporations' roles in all this political discourse? Well, like, if we want to take it back to the Citizens United case, which basically said, you know, corporate money is political speech, is free speech, it's money, like, you know, like they can contribute to campaigns and stuff, then based in the United States context, based on our judicial system, like they have a right to weigh in on these things. Now, whether or not we think that their input is valid because their interests are obviously corrupted by their business model, and, you know, there's like conflicts of interest everywhere, it's another question, but I'm looking forward to seeing, you know, what happens with Hong Kong amidst all the other uncertainty with the trade war and everything else. But
yeah, I mean, you know, ultimately, I don't think that you could tell the story of Hong Kong to a single American and they hear it and not come out in support of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is trying to protest on fundamental human rights that are guaranteed to us by our Constitution. They want the right to free speech. They want
talk to some tankies and some Mao apologists, and they might disagree.
Well, true, right? But you know, I saw that tweet thread too about like the how Mao started his whole rebellion by killing the landlords, and I saw you know, just tweet after tweet saying like, "Oh, this is great," kind of stuff, and it like gave me, you know, chills a little bit, like seeing Americans tweet out in support of the Mao communist revolution. But you know, that's a total tangent that we don't need to go
latent
into.
communism, like it's building among a lot of younger millennials. Like,
I mean, radicalism on either side is
I
sort
agree.
of what everybody's used to now, you know?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you got like white nationalism on one side, and then you've got like extreme, like, I don't know, leftist communist tendencies on the other.
Well, yeah, and I mean, from the extreme communist, you know, leftist, really that's America's economy's fault. Like, this is a group of people that basically haven't been able to engage with capitalism in a successful way, and because of that, they disavow capitalism. And it's like that's not a smart way to go, right? Because like the opposite is Venezuela and the Soviet Union and China, and basically every single mass genocide you've ever seen was in some way from a socialist or communist government. So that's
be a hot take with a lot of people.
That will be.
Real quick, Brandon, one thing I wanted to add, like, virtue signaling makes this all really complicated because everyone's trying to like take the Hong Kong protests and sort of like play it to for their own benefit, which that sucks. That's kind of just like the weird social media like meta world we're in. But like, I think one thing, Tyler Cowen, this like economist I really like, he on his blog he posted this story. He made this point basically that media outlets are like, they're covering these topics but they're downplaying it a lot. Like he was talking about how ESPN's published like 1 or 2 articles about it. They probably updated since then, but he posted this on like October 10th. And they basically, they wrote these articles, but they never made it seem like it was a big deal. And it's like a huge deal. And like that's the thing is like, there's also if you go to just like the base level of all of this, it's like there are people just essentially not giving this issue what it needs.
Yeah, I mean, and to backtrack a little bit on my devil's advocate role, the Hong Kong protests are the single biggest thing probably happening in the world right now. I mean, This is an economic powerhouse that has weird relationships with China, where part of their entire existence, there was written in this point that they're going to have to at some point actually join mainland China. And a lot of people, the Chinese kind of counterpoint is that this is kind of the first step in them eventually joining mainland China. And you're seeing people be like, no, we like capitalism. We like freedom. We like being able to be in Hong Kong and not have to be part of the Chinese system. We're not going to stand for this, and we're going to, in fact, stand up against this. And you can draw all the comparisons you want to an American Revolution, to a French, ideal revolution, all this kind of this is an incredibly important thing that's happening right now, and it is not getting enough attention. I 100% agree. The only question is how do we give it the right attention? And I think that right now we're kind of floundering on it.
And I will say too, just quick side note, ESPN is owned by Disney, so.
All of your favorite brands are owned by like 5 companies. All right.
One quick last point, because I think I just want to put this out there now. The best game day sign for college football on Saturday is going to be someone holding up a sign saying, the only people who hate this sign more than China is ESPN. And I'll let that sink in for a second, because it's going to be just
if that actually ends up happening, I'll give you $5 on Monday.
If it doesn't happen, I'm disappointed with our entire populace, because there should be all sorts of really great China signs at the next game day.
Yeah,
we're missing a huge opportunity for now.
I mean, dude, you should tweet at some people and make sure that happens, because that's actually pretty good.
Well, it's college kids, right? They're going to make it happen
for sure. Yeah. All right, so last topic on the table for discussion today: Gab is doubling down on Bitcoin. It is going to integrate the Lightning Network. This is something they've had planned for a while. And they're also going to launch some Bitcoin educational resources in a bid to introduce Bitcoin, as they say, and I quote, to 1 million new users. So for those of you who don't know what Gab is, most of you probably do, it is I will say, controversial network. It's an alternative social media platform. The UI and UX is a lot like Twitter, but it has become largely a hub for conservative voices, some of which are on the alt and far right. I wrote an article about this week, and I put controversial in the title. Someone said, what's controversial about free speech? Well, free speech is very controversial. It's one of the things that gets argued about the most in our democracy. And one of the reasons why it is so controversial is because the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter from 2018 actually frequented the site and posted white nationalist rhetoric on it a lot. And this is kind of Gab's stick. Barring obvious illegal content like child porn, or soliciting drug sales and things like that, Gab will not moderate what you put on the website. And this has obviously drawn a lot of criticism from the mainstream media, which is largely liberally leaning. No offense to anyone out there if you think that it's not. You're kind of kidding yourself. What ended up happening, especially with after the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, Gab was already getting running into a lot of resistance from web service providers and things like that. But following that, it was the last straw. Cloudflare kicked them off of their web hosting. Gab found an alternative web host after that. Since this has happened, they've also been deplatformed from numerous payment processors like PayPal, Stripe, Square, and also Visa, MasterCard. I think like 50-plus banks will not accept deposits from Gab's business account or from its founder, Andrew Torba. Let's see, what else? AOL and Yahoo has blacklisted Gab email addresses. Google also has filed them as spam. By default, Google and Firefox have blocked Gab's Descent browser extension, which is basically like this comment section. It's a browser extension for a comment section that you can integrate with like any website on the web, and it allows for free and open discussion in that. They blocked that, so Gab ended up forking the Brave browser, which is a part of the basic attention token thing, and they forked that browser, started their own browser. And now you can get Dissenter on that. But like they're building out basically an in-house suite of all these things. They're building their own email service. They've integrated Bitcoin payments through BTC Pay Server. Now they're doing Lightning. And one of the things that I think is fascinating about this is Gab began as an oasis for ostracized voices, usually on the far right, to go and have a place to exercise free speech. Now the free speech hub is being censored. And it still can't be censored because Gab is using free and open source software to develop their own toolkit so that they can basically be self-sufficient. I mean, this is like one of the most Bitcoin companies out there in terms of like self-reliance. And now they are doubling down on Bitcoin as an avenue to fund themselves. It makes up 30% of their revenue right now. And anyway, I just think this is a crazy story. Not a lot of people are talking about it, but
yeah, I mean, there's a few things that jump out at me about all of this. Number one is that this is further proof that, things created on the internet, you cannot be destroyed, right? Like there's an anti-fragility that's there that it'll morph, it'll continue to exist as long as there's a market for it. My thing about Gab is that I think their goal is pure in intention, but their plan is half-baked in that there's a need for conversations like free speech to exist in all forms, right? But there's also a need to bring that free speech into the fold of society where metered, central or even opposing voices can be heard alongside radical voices. And, there can be the normal kind of facilities of a society folded into what's going on. Right now, Gab is this kind of, haven, if you're part of them, and cesspool if you're on the other side of free speech. And most of the free speech is hateful and it's racist, or, not all of it, right? Like there's fine people on both sides, right? Tongue in cheek. But the point is that because they're offering this ability for some radical people to have their free speech, and there's no one there to be an opposing viewpoint, that free speech just gets to kind of perpetuate unchecked. And because
yeah, and I guess kind of what you're getting at there is obviously so something like Gab just perpetuates the echo chamber problem, right? But I would also say, depending on how you want to frame it, and I'm not saying that you're necessarily saying the opposite of this, but that's partly the fault of mainstream social media. You know what I mean? If you didn't ban these people in the first place, then they wouldn't have to go to another forum where they could just be radicalized further.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's where our shortcomings are. We've ostracized people with these radical views, and now they have a place to still go where they can continue to espouse those radical views to the other people who also have them. And it's like there's a positive feedback loop that's created there, whereas we had kind of a negative, normalizing feedback loop in society in general. Now these people don't have to hear, why they're wrong. And
Like Bitcoiners.
well, I mean, sure. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that you can kind of tie this into the Bitcoin movement as well. But, the point is that a society, a free society needs to have free flowing thoughts and ideas. And if all of a sudden we're drawing circles around different ideas and pushing them off onto different platforms where no one has to see them, that just leads to some dangerous ideological development that ultimately can lead to things like the Pittsburgh shooting, like other, radical acts of violence that are going to spring up from this unchecked free speech. So, Gab's ideal is good and pure, but until there's some sort of mechanism by which the greater world can fold into these conversations, I think it's actually kind of a dangerous platform.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
actually don't know if like a platform like it's kind of funny because when you talk about Gab like that, I almost think of like Twitter echo chambers, and you just outside of crypto think of like some narrow, deep, dark alley of Twitter. Let's just say it's I don't know. I can't think of. There's
Ethereum Twitter,
Ethereum Twitter. Sure. I mean, we'll poke at Ethereum Twitter, but I really just mean anything. that's,
XRP
like,
Twitter.
Yeah, like outside of crypto, there's even like topics of just just random like obsessions or hobbies, or basically little cult movements. But even in those environments, that's a free speech platform, sort of. But that's Twitter, and even on those little in those echo chambers, you still kind of have the same environment. So I don't even know if it's necessarily about the platform itself, if as opposed to more just the.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just human nature, right? Like we tend to congregate around people who reflect and share our ideas, our values, and our views. And just look at political groups on Twitter, right? Or political groups on Facebook. Like they're always either conservative, liberal, leftist, anarchists, things like that. And people are going to. You're never going to stop people from finding people who they agree with and whom they can share ideas with. And that's why I really do think there's something to be said about the fact that we don't really need speech where a dude's going online saying we need to kill all the Jews, we need to kill people who aren't white, right? Like that's toxic, that's terrible. But at the same time, if you ban that speech, they're just going to go to 4chan, they're just going to go to Gab, they're going to go to Minds, they're going to find another place that will host their vitriol, right?
I mean, if you want to take a step back and zoom out, right? Really, there's been a capacity for violence that has evolved in the last 60 years, right? Kind of with the advent of the atomic bomb, right? And alongside that capacity for violence was an interconnectedness of the world. So where all of a sudden, you don't have people able to, except for pockets, like the Middle East or, other places where there's been extremist kind of, breeding grounds. There's been alongside the ability to do real widespread harm, there's been a need to integrate into the greater society. But now, if you want to put an inflection point around 2010 and when social media really started taking off, we've created a way by which people can recursively seclude themselves from the greater societal dialogue and still increase their capacity for violence while decreasing their need to rely on, socially other people like their neighbors. And so because of that, we're creating this weird way where you can pocket yourself into a radical sect while also not integrating with society and then not having any of your ideals checked. And it's it is a problem not just with Gab. It is a problem with all social
It's a problem
media.
with the internet, yeah. Because the internet, on one hand, can encourage basically independent study, and if you're intellectually curious person, you can research anything you want to and find any interest on the internet and engage with people who share that interest. But by the same token, what you're getting at is it does encourage collectivism.
Right.
And collectivism is only getting worse. I mean, like, that's the funny thing too about I think the alt-right movement, right? Like they rage against identity politics, but their identity politics manifests in a movement for white dudes, basically.
Exactly. I mean, they use the same arguments to defend that.
Yeah.
And it's totally weird how diversity of thought and free speech eventually leads to like pockets, tribes of like homogeneity. You know?
But it doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't
So strange.
have to. That's what I'm kind of like trying to get at.
Yeah.
Well,
is
it doesn't
that-
have to, but what we're starting to see is, like, given how the internet's structured, given how innate human psychology, that's where we're going. So, like the $1 million question, how the fuck do you fix it?
Well, right. And I mean, I'm not going to pretend like I'm the first person to have thought of this, right? There's got to be people at Twitter, Facebook, all of these places that are actively trying to figure out the answer to this question.
Yeah.
I'm an optimist. I think we're going to find the answer. I think right now the path that they've chosen is this deplatforming path, and I think that they didn't anticipate the second and third order results and consequences from the deplatforming, which was, all right, I'm not able to have a platform here. I'm going to move over here where there's other, crazy, extreme people that I can talk to more easily. And, I don't even have to listen to the noise of people saying, wow, you're crazy and extreme. Now I can just listen to other people who are like, yes, you're right. And so, I think this is a solvable problem. I think this is a problem maybe we'll solve in the next decade even, and we'll all be better off because of it. But until then, with these solutions like Gab, I'm so wary of them, and I'm not sold that it's going to be a net good. And based on the data and all the stuff that's happened so far with Gab, it's hard to say that it has been a good. Now, is it anti-fragile? Is it using Bitcoin? Is it adopting all the ideologies that we have as Bitcoiners? Sure. But
Brandon, I hate to
how do you be a pragmatist?
just like come and completely disagree with you, but I think in the future everything is going to be more fractionalized. I think there's going to be a lot more tribes. I mean, like if you take the example of like cryptocurrency supporters and enthusiasts being a thing that starts, and then you have all these people who are supporting certain coins. Like, I think that's something that we're going to see like across the board, just because as more interests develop, you can get more specific about how you feel about each interest. And I also feel like this is like the issue of the public square, and like Jesus Christ, like our public square is like complicated in 2019. But I think that I think it's going to get worse. I feel like this is like a issue that's always been an issue throughout time.
Yeah, but the thing is that this has been an issue throughout time, but there's been solutions that have sprung up throughout time, and we've had it's a pendulum, right? We swing away, we become tribal, and then we swing back, and we all come together, and then we swing away, and and so we're on a really far swing towards becoming tribalistic, and everyone's secluded in their own bubble, but. There's such an opportunity as a capitalist to create a solution where, part of this swinging away has led to people feeling lonely. We have the highest rates of people identifying as lonely in society today as in the history of the world, right? Like people are not connected, and yet they have the single most empowering connective tool in the history of the world too. There's going to be a solution that marriages the fact that you have the internet, you're able to connect with people, and the fact that you need to have meaningful connection with people around you who can challenge you and can make you think and can not just agree until you feel like that your views aren't even going to be successful.
Well, yeah, people just need less screen time. We'll close out with this because it's getting a little long, but I was reading this Vox article recently. I can't remember the reporter, but she did a really good job. This really long feature where she went and profiled famous TikTok users in Mobile, Alabama.
So weird.
Yeah, it was weird. And she talked to a clinical psychologist, and basically what she said is with the advent of social media, especially when you have just normal everyday people getting superstar level amounts of attention, with their engagement on Twitter, TikTok, whatever you have, Instagram, all these things.
Probably insane.
Yeah, basically what's happening is they're starting to experience the same kind of social isolation and disconnection that celebrities have always felt, right? Where like you're famous, you're quote unquote well liked, everyone knows who you are, but that doesn't satisfy, and you're still despondent and depressed as hell. And going back to what Brandon was saying, if you really want to engage with these extremely complex topics, I think this is why long form podcasts are becoming more popular. Yeah, gnarly, bro. With things like Joe Rogan and other guys too, and other women and all the people part of this really resurgence in podcasts, is this idea that we are hungry for long form, intelligible discussion. Yeah, anything.
Long form writing too.
Yeah, seriously, that's like. Yeah, like blogs, like through Medium and stuff like that. Because like when you get in a comment war with people on Twitter, I mean, how many times have we seen it on Twitter, Facebook, anything? You're not engaging with ideas. It's all about one-upping what someone else said and just getting out the witticism and just like saying something crushing. But it does not lend itself to actually having informed debate or dialectic, right? Like it's all about rhetoric at this point. It's like you're just trying to disprove someone. You're not arguing in good faith. And kind of to round off the episode and hit on something Brandon was saying, Gab is not encouraging debate. It's just encouraging a bunch of people to scream into the void on Gab with a bunch of people who agree with them. Not too unlike some other places on the internet.
What I think is the single best solution to ostracize people who are extreme is to be able to sit at a table, grab a beer with them, and chat about whatever you want to chat about.
Wait, ostracize them or like integrate them into society?
Integrate them over a beer, over food, over a happy hour, and just enjoy the conversation. And it's a small step towards, building that community again.
Yeah, it's the human element. When you're screaming at a profile picture with your keyboard over the internet, there's nothing there. But like, people are often much more cordial when they're face to face. But anyway, I think that rounds out episode 2 of Bitcoin Magazine Happy Hour. You can find me on Twitter at As I Lay Hodling. And where can our listeners find the rest of y'all?
I'm Dave Hollerith. You can find me at DS Hollers. That's it.
I'm on Twitter as Brandon_D_Green. I'm going to work on getting a better handle, but that's what I got right now.
Last name Taiberg.
Hell yeah, it is. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in, and we hope to see you next week. Peace, guys.